So today we are going to talk about
So today we are going to
there we
talk
go. All right, our
about
backup is working. And we can go over here. All right, so here today we're going to talk about the way that main stages, big stages, finally in the middle of the 20th century start attempting to make diversity a priority on the big stage, right? So we have talked a lot last week about early jazz and middle jazz era, so like World War One, World War Two, and how um, after the Civil War, after Reconstruction, and into Great Migration era. So that's basically like the 1870s through 1920, 19 mid 20s. How you really started to see black music and black dancing become the most famous type of performance and activity basically worldwide. But we are still, of course, in deep segregation, deep racism, Jim Crow, lynchings, like all of that stuff is continuing to go on, even though we're after the Civil War. And so while there were finally not just white actors pretending to be black people and doing blackface minstrelsy, but there were also black performers who are finally getting to perform and reclaim their own movement and dance styles on stage, and how that really was like a big conundrum and a process that people had to go through in order to claim fame and economic profits from the industry. And so then from the and remember, I'm making generalizations here, so there's definitely going to be exceptions to what I'm saying here. But today we're going to look at what happened from approximately World War II through sort of let's say up to the 80s, if I'm giving a big era, and how you see that the country is supposedly on board with equality. But of course, we know that the big push for civil rights didn't happen until the 60s, although it took from the 20s to build up to that, and we're still fighting that fight today. But there was sort of a more public attempt to be more inclusive on the big stage, and that happened in a couple of ways, and we're going to talk about them in this category called diversity in sort of two big sections. The first one that we're going to look at today is really fusion. Remember when we started this class, we talked about the difference between hybridity and fusion. And fusion is when you have kind of two genres or aesthetics pushed together, mashed together, but often they're mashed together by the person who comes from the group that has sort of more socioeconomic power. And they can end up being appropriative because of that. And so there some good things come out of it, some changes happen, as we were talking about the last economics and tap, and like dealing with stereotypes in the last section. In this section on diversity, we're going to start with the fusion sections that come up with some amazing works that really change America's way of thinking about black artistic aesthetics as high art and not just low art or casual fun, but taking them seriously on the big stage. And then next week 10, we're going to talk about diversity in arts and dance in terms of the hybrid model, which would be that authentic practitioners take their work and start to push it up the class lines in more, and this happened more on modern dance stages. But all of these things overlap, but that's generally how I'm splitting up our materials for the next couple of weeks. So this week we're going to talk about how those Africanist elements got blended together with ballet in order to give us Broadway jazz dance. So we were talking a lot about Broadway tap in the early part of the 20th century, and so mid-century on. So roughly when I'm saying that, I'm thinking like World War II-ish, or you could even go back. It starts sort of in the 30s through 1980s and today, we still see all of these musicals on stage. So African elements blending with ballet to give us these extraordinarily athletic choreographed dances. We're going to talk a little bit about how in the mid-century, right? So you're thinking like 1950s fedora hat style, which we just watched Smooth Criminal by MJ. You can see that he's definitely referencing that. I have a better picture. Put that down here. Toot, 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 toot. Right? So MJ is definitely referencing this this jazz dance. This is sort of a 1940s theme that's going on here, 30s, 40s, but mostly 40s. And we know also as a fact that Michael Jackson was a huge fan of Fred Astaire. And so we're going to look at the dance that influenced Smooth Criminal. And also in the mid-century that there's this change in art that takes us to this really like abstract and sort of neatened and simplified motif that comes from primitivism, which is an artistic term. I know it does not sound very good now, but it's a term that's used for certain kinds of art that was popular in the 1920s. So it is what it is. And then historically today, we're going to go over the American Dream and how vaudeville sold that to America and how the American government failed people about it. So overall, the question today is, what is it to be American? And I have in our writing, I think the page is open here. We have this question that I included for folks who wanted to perhaps pre-submit, but nobody pre-submitted this week. So just know that some of these discussions that have in the title pre-submit option, for folks who are watching the recordings, I've put in a couple of opportunities for those of you who definitely can't be here with us live to participate in the conversation by submitting your answers to a question or two online as an assignment. And that would give you some extra credit even if you can't be here in person. Okay, so my questions for today are, how do you define American? And there's no right or wrong answer to this, but I just want to give everybody an opportunity to sort of ponder what it means to be American culturally, because I think in the mid-century, that is definitely what people are trying to express, right? So in the beginning of the 20th century, we had World War I and World War II, and mid-century is coming out of World War II. So there have been millions of young men have died all around the world. And also we have all of these young men coming back from the World War, which if you're an American man, you won the world for democracy and freedom. And so people who come back to America, and then there's like an economic boom because there's all of this, well, there have been a lot of military resources made, but there's a big change. And you think about that idea of 1950s America, where they're trying to encourage all of the men who are coming back from abroad to start families and to buy homes, and that whole idea that we have of like the nuclear family, 2.6 kids, white picket fence, grass yard, a car. All of those ideas come out of America as a political force trying to rebuild stability and economically after World War II. So that comes across in culture as well. So how do you define American? I'm encouraging folks, if you, now this one is past, but for the sake of discussion, I was encouraging folks to think about a dance video that is an example of what is American in dance or culture. So to sort of identify what things look American to you. And the other question is, what is contemporary dance? And this one might be a good one to talk about next week, because we're going to look at more of the modern dancers next week. So maybe we'll save that for then. But let me just read it out so you know. Contemporary dance is a term that's currently used, like today, 2023, for concert dancing based on modern dance, which would be Graham, Ailey Horton, postmodern, and Tharp, which has evolved to include release technique, contact improvisation, and modern fused with street dancing and world dances or any other movement. But we're going to talk about Catherine Dunham next week. Sorry, I have a typo in there. Shame! I'll fix that. Dunham's style of modern dance blended modern dance training with Afro-Caribbean influences and jazz dance. But the word contemporary dance is also used today in 2023 to describe dancing that blends hip-hop, contact improvisation, and sometimes release techniques. So like what I would call lyrical hip-hop is also called contemporary dance today. And there's a big discussion going on about the diversity, or about who sort of owns the name. Interestingly, this same argument went on in the 1920s about the word modern dance, because the modern dancers, like this group here that we're talking about, well, actually even earlier than them, but like Graham and Isadora Duncan and then Dunham, they all use the term modern dance for their modern dance, which we're going to see next week. But people who were doing jazz dance and Lindy Hop at the time also, so the popular social dance also claimed the word modern, and there was a bit of a tussle about who got to use the name. In the long term, I would say that jazz dance is what we call the dancing of the 1920s, the social dancing and Lindy Hop, even in performative form, and that modern dance is what we call the concert dance. So, but the jury's still out on what we're going to call contemporary dance in the long run. I think they might actually just grow together. So let's save that question for next week. And you guys can pre-submit it to next week's discussion assignment. I'll move it over since it needs an edit. I'll leave this open to remind myself what this is. This is Dunham. Catherine Dunham. There is a Duncan, and she's an earlier modern dance teacher. Okay. Oh, wait, this is the week 10 question. So yeah, you can answer these questions for next week. Good. All right. Okay. Bum, 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 bum. So we're looking at mid-century modern and musical theater this week. And so what I want to talk about in terms of how I would define part of American is the idea of the American dream. And so I want to start by saying that the idea of the American dream has been around for a couple hundred, if not 400 years. Yeah, maybe 400 years of the American dream as an idea. But I really am questioning, and I think our country is really questioning, whether the American dream exists anymore or is possible enough. Like, people are losing faith in the American dream, I think, at this period in time. So where does the American dream come from, and what is it? Do you know? Because in the last year or so, I feel like people don't automatically know, but students previous to that could just name it. So I think that the American dream has been advertised as the idea that anyone in America can, through their own hard work and ingenuity, access enough economic opportunity to eventually own a home with a life partner and children that they can support. And traditionally this has been the traditional conservative idea about this means that, of course, that there is a patriarch of that family, and that the man supports the wife and children, and that they own a home, and that you can retire, right? So that this idea that, like, every family and everybody who comes to America can support a family if they put in enough hard work. And I think in the 2000s we're deeply questioning that as we examine more equity issues. We just know that that's not true for everybody, and that the people who it is still mostly true for, we are now referring to those people as having white privilege. and so rather than the American dream being then a dream that's for everyone, culture today is acknowledging that the American dream has really been a myth for certainly many minorities, if not all minorities and those of lower income. But from the time of, and this is where this picture comes in, from the time of Manifest Destiny, this was what was advertised to people to get people to come to America, which is ironic, right? Because there are conservative political forces in this country right now who are trying to keep immigrants out. But if you think about the origins of our nation, before the United States, Northern America was populated by native peoples who had their own nations and societies. And then the Europeans came in first as explorers and then as colonizers. And then after a series of wars, we ended up with, America and and up to becoming America, and certainly at the time of America became the theme was like the selling mantra was manifest destiny. And this is about the like whitest, most Karenist idea you can possibly think of. So here we have an illustration of, I think this is Columbia, actually, the goddess of I don't know what. There was a great professor moment, right? So she is traveling across the country. She is stringing either electrical or telegraph wire. I'm not quite sure. She's carrying a book because, the stereotype is that the white European people are coming and bringing knowledge. And down here we have like the Wells Fargo Mail Express. We have pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail. And we have coal miners traveling out, and like behind the coal miners and explorers, you have people who are starting to farm the land, right? And the rail is slowly coming across the country. And over here you have basically like a generic version of sort of Boston and New York area. You can see all the trading ships bringing tea, and trains are going across here, right? Because we had 3 major train lines. And then there's the like awful part of this picture over here in the darkness where the white people haven't brought the light yet, she said in an extremely sarcastic voice. You can actually see that this painting is showing native people running in fear, which was absolutely authentic to the way that European culture saw the colonization of America, right? You have like the Rockies or the Sierra Nevadas over here roughly, and basically the white people are bringing the light and scaring the native people off the land. Wow. It's dark. But it was not seen that way at the time. This was seen as the God-given right of the explorers to come and settle the lands of North and South America. And so that is called manifest destiny, which it sure seems like there should be a type here. So this idea of manifest destiny was sort of picked up and mythologized by vaudeville. And so there was an article that I had included here by a man called McLean, but it was pretty intense reading, so I have since removed it. But if this fascinates you, please let me know. I'd be happy to share the article with you. His idea is that vaudeville itself, capital V vaudeville, so like big shows that you would see in music halls like this, that because of the nature of their shows, they helped to sort of foster, like plant the seeds of and bring up the seeds or inculcate this mythology of the American dream. So not only does America, the United States of America, have this European taught and believed idea of manifest destiny, that white people have the right to conquer from the East Coast to the West Coast, but also that anybody can be successful in America. And so pretty much all of the shows on vaudeville, which, have only just barely started to have like a theme throughout, right, in the 1890s to 1920s, because vaudeville with a little v was like, little touring arts companies that would do basically variety shows, like you might think of a talent show. So there might be a little excerpt of a play. There's a number of songs. Maybe the songs are on the same theme, but more likely the songs are just like whatever those actors sounded good doing. By the time we get to capital V vaudeville, you have this integration of the show that becomes musical theater as we know it, which is to say all the songs, all the dances, all the costumes are on one theme, and eventually they have one storyline or text that links them all together. And as that process evolved, one of the most common popular storylines would come in many different forms, but it was always plucky young dude comes to the big city from either rural America, so like a farm somewhere, or immigrating to the city, although that was less popular, but certainly it was true of many of the people in places like New York City where vaudeville really blew up, that you had immigrants or people coming into the city seeking their economic fortunes, and that through ingenuity and hard work, cleverness, and luck, capital L-U-C-K, aka privilege, the young person would outsmart someone who was the bad guy and win money or a career and the girl. And usually, interestingly, the bad guy was often some sort of like huge crushing industrial mogul or like a rich guy right? Because America sort of came from a bunch of people escaping the British monarchy and the colonialist oppression that was happening even in England. So even though the people who came from England are now seen as the colonists and oppressors in America, from their perspective, in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, a lot of those people were escaping oppression, often religious oppression. So in England, you could practice the Church of England religion, and if you didn't want to do that, if you wanted to be a Protestant, for example, then you were oppressed. You were like both legally and socially ousted from society in different ways. And so those people escaped from England as part of the colonization process. And the same was true of people who did petty crimes. Like you might have a choice between getting your hand cut off, this is a long time ago, but or being hung for highway robbery, for example, or you could be put on a ship where you might die on the way to America and go colonize. And those are the indentured servants that we talked about, who are brought to America by ship with a contract that they have to fulfill, but they are not slaves. So that idea that you have these like rebels, and eventually they did rebel, right? They threw the tea in the land because they were being overtaxed, and so that started the blah, blah, blah. That is part of our sort of taught identity of as Americans, that we came from elsewhere and that we picked ourselves up by our bootstraps, and that Americans have a God-given right to economic success and self-sufficiency, and that we also have like an inborn individuality, like we don't necessarily listen to the boss, and that we, by being plucky and outspoken and brave, we can get whatever we want. And the question is, who is this we? Even in the time of big vaudeville, right, you can see like the cowboy's gonna race in order to win his bride, or like the henchman, right? Who is we is usually some white guy, and not usually a female protagonist, not usually a person of color. In this era of vaudeville, capital V, You usually have mostly white audiences, although you do have females, like wives, in public with their husbands at these shows at this point. But by the time we get to the mid-century, we've been through 2 world wars, remember, where we're talking about how most of those white men who like controlled the economic entertainment because they owned all of the income, then since those groups were out of the country for 2 long bouts and many of them died, the women and people of color who finally got to have jobs and make their own income started to have influence on what the vaudeville shows created. And the vaudeville shows, when we're talking about after World War II, really start to become Broadway as we know it, musical theater as we know it. And so the themes at that time finally are starting to change to actually be more diverse. But of course they don't get it right, because how would it be a theme if they get it right the first time? Okay, so last week we talked a bit about the Great Migration. So the Great Migration is mostly considered to happen during World War I, right? The black people who were living in the South were escaping the black codes and the lynching and the Ku Klux Klan, and they were able to spread out across the country because of World War I having drawn so many of the white working men out of the country, and so there were job openings. So then and after that, we have the New Deal, which you might not know the name of. What's the New Deal, right? So the New Deal is an agreement, it's policy that was created by the government after the Great Crash. So between World War I and going into World War II, because the Great Depression was a major cause of World War II. Just to recap that, 1929, we have the market crash. That is the biggest market crash that we've ever had. It's bigger than the one that caused the Great Recession within your lifetime. And in the 1920s, which many people see similar lines to what's going on today, there was so much corporate power, and like capital was really owned by these moguls who had claimed that they were going to be responsible towards everybody, but of course they just had all the money at the top. Ha ha ha, no surprise. There was not very much financial regulation until after World War II, when things like Dodd-Frank, which was removed in 2016, which protects against banks failing. For those of you here with me in March of 2023, we just had 2 fairly large banks failed that the government is bailing out the people who had their money in the bank, although the banks themselves are getting punished. But this is a similar situation to what happened with the Great Market Crash of 1929. Did I say 39 earlier? I hope not. 1929, the market crashes. And it crashes so badly with no backup and no protection from the government, so that people are literally like, your whole life savings is gone and there's no getting it back. People who are absolutely rich, but rich in investments, aka stocks, bonds, etc., become poor overnight. And this is also crossed with the Dust Bowl. Gosh, we need an image of the Dust Bowl. Let's pull one up. Dust Bowling. Okay. Images. So I was just reading a great book about Dorothea Lange, who's the photographer who took many of these absolutely famous images from the Dust Bowl. So what happened was that due to terrible farming practices and terrible weather, the Great Plains, so like the middle of our whole country, basically all the crops dried up in a drought, and then the soil, the topsoil, was gone and just turned to dust. And so literally like the center of the country where all of these people had been living on farming, everybody lost everything, right? Your farms are nothing but dust, like there's dust storms. And so people are migrating further west. The farming community especially are migrating further west looking for work, and there were like intermittent work camps and people were starving, and it was really incredibly rough time. So this is happening at the same time as the Great Depression, right? So market crash, Dust Bowl, basically most of America, like a huge amount of America, is totally and completely out of work. And this is also a similar version of this is happening in Europe. So one of the ways that the Nazi Party gained power in Germany is because there was also a great recession there due to the market crash. And so when there is extreme poverty and struggle, then people tend to align with more extremist political views, and that is how they accepted the Nazis with their, frankly, American-based racist ideologies, and the fascists came to power in Europe, and then we had to fight the fascists in World War II. So you can see Dust Bowl, no joke, right? So once World War II wraps up, the Nazis are defeated by the Allied forces, which is America, the British Empire, the French, the folks who didn't align with the Nazis or the social. I feel like there's three. My World War II info needs more backup. But let me get us back to art. So as World War II stops, the people come home, and the government also always wants to take these men who are inevitably traumatized by fighting in war and to put them straight to work so that they can be like rebuilding their lives and move on, right? So that of course means that the women and people of color who have been working in those factory jobs get booted out so that the white men can work again. And this moral ideology of the father of the household American dream gets pushed in order to put those men back to work, those, most likely to be able to vote for politicians, men, the white men. And one of the ways that the government promotes fiscal stability for the economy is by Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac loan programs for first-time and second-time home ownership. So one of the things that the New Deal did, and the New Deal refers to the government policies to try and put America back together after the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, really, right? The government invested heavily in art and technology development. If you think about Coit Tower, if you've ever been to Coit Tower and seen all those beautiful paintings inside, those are New Deal funded. And also home loans. So this home loan program is where we get to redlining. And let's zoom in. Okay. Do I have a bigger picture of this? I think this was the best one I got. Okay. So this is a map of San Francisco, and it is a map that is given to banks who are going to negotiate home loans to home buyers in San Francisco. And it is delineated by neighborhoods so that neighborhoods which are the most likely to be good investments for the bank in terms of when a bank gives you a home loan, if you should default and the bank has to foreclose on you and take your building back, that it's most likely that the bank is going to make back their money, and even better, make back their money with a profit, right? So that means homes that have higher value are more likely to be safe investments for the bank when the bank invests in you by giving you a home loan. And that's what this New Deal map is showing, is that the banks and the federal government are saying here, well, these are the neighborhoods where the houses are worth the most money. And so if you get someone applying for a loan, you want to invest in the loans that have, blue and green colors first, because that's the safest place to make your investment. And then if you have to give out loans to those yellow and red areas, well, sometimes you got to do that. But this is redlining. So what that means is that in the blue and green areas, you are going to be giving out more loans that are worth more money. And in the red and yellow areas, you are going to be not giving as much money, so the house prices remain lower and it's harder to get a loan in those neighborhoods. And can you guess where the white people and the people of color live based on this map? I bet you can. Right? That's exactly what's going on here. The houses that are worth, the real estate that's worth more tends to be in neighborhoods that are already populated by wealthier people, right? You have like Pacific Heights is up here, Russian Hill gets a little bit shadier, but when we're talking about lower income neighborhoods, they're redlined. And that act, which makes sense on paper when you're just thinking about financial, like we haven't even talked about people, but you're like, okay, there's bigger houses over here, there's maybe better schools, less industrial waste like there is in these red areas. All of those things, when you're turning it into a policy for home loans, segregate the city, make it more difficult for people of color to access wealth, make it more difficult for people of color to be able to own their own homes, because not only do these people who can afford a more expensive house have access to bigger loans, but people who can't afford a house, maybe they still want to like build home equity, but they are not going to get as much money from the loan process for that house, and it's going to be harder to get through the application process because the bank is resistant to investing in these communities. And so this redlining process, here's the same idea over in Oakland and Berkeley, Alameda. This process is like just a clear as day on paper way in which racism is institutionalized, right? So like there's nothing here that says black people can't get a loan, and yet everything here says it's harder for a black person to get a house. And what happens when you don't allow a family to invest in their home? It means that multiple generations lose capital and investment, right? So for example, let's say your great grandparents, two families, one family, let's say they both even like work in the same grocery store, but one family can get a loan to buy a house and the other family can't get a loan. So that means, or let's just say it's like much, much harder and they can only get a smaller loan, right? So even if they were buying houses that were kind of close in amounts, the people who have easier access to a loan are going to get started earlier, so they're going to pay less interest. They're going to have more wealth because they're probably getting paid more if they're living and working in a better neighborhood than the people who are otherwise not doing so. And then you have this third family can't get a house at all, right? So this first family is putting all of their money into paying back the loan and owning a house. And so as that house gets paid off, then all of that income that they make becomes savings. This second family, they have less money in their loans, so maybe it takes them longer to pay off the interest on the mortgage. So that means less of their income is spent on savings. And the third family, who can't get a loan at all because they can only afford houses from their work in the red areas, they are spending all of that money that the other two families have been investing on rent, which means if it's rent, it's gone. And so when you own a home, there are a lot of expenses. It's not like once you pay off your mortgage, there's nothing to pay for, but it's an enormous difference. And then let's like just move down the family tree another rung. Let's say all three of those families, no home, small loan, big loan, all three of those families have kids, and those kids go through life working sometimes, having kids, doing all the things that families do. But there's another great recession, right? And so some of those people lose their jobs, right? So what happens to the family over here where the house is fully paid off and there's savings, but and like maybe this family is retired up here, but their kids and grandkids, the kids have lost their jobs. Well, those two kids can take their grandkids and go live with grandma and grandpa where there's very little rent to be paid because the house is paid off and there's a savings cushion to protect the next two generations. This place in the middle, maybe there's no savings, but the house is paid off, so they're like a little bit cutting it closer to the bone, right? The families can move in, be home, make it through the hard times, and if they get a job again when the recession is over, then they can start building savings again. This family who has never been able to own a home, who's always put all of their rent money into rent, who hasn't been able to save anything because there's nothing to save, you're still paying rent. When those people, their kids lose jobs, they can't really like move into a place that shares the cost of rent because everybody's still paying rent, right? There's no cushion, there's no savings, there's no rent cushion, there's nothing. Everybody's still in trouble, and basically then you end up starting to take more loans out on your credit cards to pay for the bills. So this sort of redlining action that happens just to, protect bank investments for the stability of the country results in extreme and like self-amplifying inequity for these three families, right? And some of the case, like in the Great Migration, you might have a family that moves into Oakland, and maybe they are a family of color, but they have a good nest egg because they have a great business that they run. But maybe, although they can afford a house in the green area, the green area has a very exclusive and racist HOA, and so they won't even let that family move into the green area, even though they could afford a mortgage in a green area. They get pushed into the blue area where people are more likely to like sell their house to a person of color. Right? And then the bank won't give them the loan for the mortgage. And so you have that, like, that would be an example of maybe where a family in the middle that had as much money as the family with the fully funded loan, they started out at the same place, but because of this loan, their families end up in different spots, right? So does that help to, does that make clear redlining? Yes, no, maybe. I know we have folks on phone today, but if that makes a little sense, or if you have questions about that, you can chat. You can give me a thumbs up, a thumbs down. And while you're thinking about that question, I'm going to pull up some dance. Hooray, dance. Okay, so we talked about the irony of vaudeville, the myth of the American dream, how redlining after the Great Depression, during the Great Depression and after the Great Depression has changed the economic capabilities of multiple generations of people in America. And now we're going to talk, and that sort of leaves us at the fun parts, which is, what does that mean in the 1950s when America sees not only after World War II, not only white men who fought in the war and who are considered like noble veterans who saved the world, but also black men who fought in the war and who are considered noble veterans who saved the world in some places in America. But those people coming back, there's a lot of America who wants to give them proper respect. And I mean, I'm biased towards artists, obviously, but the artistic world really wanted to open some doors that had been closed to black communities by bringing black culture prominently on stage. And so that's where we get this Africanist elements mixed with ballet, jazz, dance that we're going to look at next. Yeah. So over here, let's take a little bit of a glance at the idea of primitivism. And we're looking at this because it's a big part of what was popular in art in the mid-century. So the mid-century artists were looking back at the 20s, and let's open this up too. Can we open this link? right? Mid-century. I think you kind of recognize this motif a little bit. And there's all this art that so this is Pablo Picasso, so 19 teens, 20s, and he's doing this art that's really abstract, and that abstract sort of influence is really super like exaggerated and popularized in the mid-century. So this is an example of like mid-century illustration and decor, and this is an example of a Picasso illustration that influenced that. And so where did these 19 teens and 20s people get this idea of abstraction? Abstraction, capital A, it's an aesthetic where you're taking as much of the complication and detail out of things to get down to basically like an idea of an essence. And let me give you an example of what came before the 1940s and 50s is Art Nouveau. So Art Nouveau was popular in the 1920s when we still had all of that like fabulous, playful money going around. And you can see there's just so much decor, and it's very obsessed with the ideas of the natural world. So in the like 10s and 20s, people are artistically trying to get away from industrial factories and bring this natural, swooping, decorative feeling back to art. But by the time we get to the 1950s, the opposite idea is true, right? People want to get back to work. They want things simple. They want things lines. They're tired of all the mess of war and moving, and they want to make it like controlled. Not that that's not a bad or good thing all the time. But that's how we get this idea of simple illustrations that were popular in the 1950s. And that is something that I want to highlight just because you can really see it in the set design in the musicals. And this idea of like paring things down to simplicity or their deeper essence that the people after Art Nouveau came to love, like Picasso and Art Deco people, that idea actually comes from ancient African art. So people like Picasso and the Art Deco, like abstract people in the art world, their inspiration was primitive, excuse the loaded term, African art. And here's some examples here, right, of like cloth work and carvings. And you can see that sorry, I'm on the wrong page. You can see that like Picasso's abstract drawings where he's like exaggerating things based on sort of a feeling, like when you meet someone and you're trying to describe them out of a crowd to someone who kind of has met them before, you might say, you know, he's that really tall guy with a really big schnoz and like he has a really intense stare. This guy, right? He's got a really big schnoz and a really intense stare. And so Picasso tried to draw things not quote unquote realistically in all of their photographic detail, but sort of with this like taking the detail and reality away and making it instead about the essence. And that idea comes from this old African art. So this, you can see this sculpture here of a head has like a really exaggerated forehead because that was considered beautiful, and like a simple line drawn that may or may not have been makeup, and like just clean lines giving you basically like the outline or the gist, the most integral gist of the person or idea that's being conveyed by the sculpture or art. So that's one way that Africanist elements appear in mid-century modern art. And we see that, okay, great, now we can get to the dance. You can see that, for example, in the set behind the Bandwagon Girl Hunt Ballet. So let's go look at that. I think it's already loaded for you. I just gotta pull it up. hold on a second. Let me reorganize my Zoom page for you. Uh-oh. There we go. Okay, so this dance is in a musical movie. That's Fred Astaire right there. You can see this mid-century modern abstracted stage back here, right? This is like a flat painted set, but it's got this weird angles like you saw in the Picasso paintings. And you can also see that reflected in their bodies, right? The bodies, instead of like naturally moving as people in the background, they're like in these angular frozen positions. This is the amazing Sid Charisse is her name. She's one of the most famous dancers of this like Hollywood musical era. Partnered with Fred Astaire a lot. But we started today watching Smooth Criminal, and that is exactly what inspired Michael Jackson, right? So you can see the MJ's version has his tap and vaudeville influenced elements, but you can also see the jazz dancing that is apparent in both of them, right? We have like the frozen moments. We have the girls doing high kicks and partner dancing. We have the syncopated freezes of the movement. And like the sort of theatrical posing, right? So he like falls down like, oh, you have knocked me over. Let me freeze in accent. That element remains in both of them.
Suddenly, all the pieces fitted together. I knew how the crime had been done. The high note on the trumpet that shattered the glass.
Goes into like a dancing fight scene. You have acrobatic flips in both. You could even call that like a breaking scene, right? A breaking freeze, the guy on the floor.
Killers have to die.
All right, I'm gonna pop us out of that loveliness. Could have watched that over and over again. All right. So I'm going to just glance in here. Sometimes I like to break this down. I think I might save this for one of our midterm discussion videos. This video here, Slap That Bass, 1937, also Fred Astaire earlier, is one of those examples of someone with real platform, right? Platform being like an economic power to get his message heard. So Fred Astaire is an enormously famous superstar. He's already made so many movies by 1937. And what he does here in this performance is, let's give us a little taste. He starts like with the black performing artists, both the band and the other dancers, so that since he has some control over the content of this movie, he's making sure to include the originators of the material. And then he like does his dance, and this whole dance is actually about mixing and choosing Africanist dance styles over ballet, which of course Fred Astaire has ballet training because he started by like watching his sister in ballet class, and then he started to take ballet and tap classes. So we're going to deep dive back into this when we review for the midterm. But it's great. Like, I encourage you to watch it first and notice what a fusion it is, because he's like, Lindy Hop has pirouettes, right? But he's sort of using this gesture of like pretty ballet hands, and he's like, ugh, I don't want to do that anymore. Look at this. Look at this. He's making really bad ballet arms right there, and then he's flinging them off. So we'll save more of that for later, but if you want to take a pre-look, it's a great example. And then I wanted to trip on over to Hot Mikado for a second. We talked about this a little bit because remember we told the story of how Bojangles was harassed by the police in front of a Broadway show that he had produced. That means put the money out for and help to choreograph and create, right? So this is actually Bojangles' show called The Hot Mikado, and it is a retelling of a classic musical theater by Rodgers and Hammerstein, or where the original, the Mikado, is British colonialists in Japan. And it's like a love story about, it's a comedic love story. It's a rom-com, right? But Bojangles did the Hot Mikado, which is like a jazz sort of parody, Orientalist parody. I mean, just look at these costumes. They're like 1920s, does a terrible idea of a kimono. Look at her like weird jazz kimono thing going on here. And so, right, let us not throw stones. This is just an example of, this is 1939, so World War II is still going on and performed at the World's Fair, but it's still, you can see the show now today, and it's just meant to be as ridiculous as possible, like with these exaggerated both Africanist and Orientalist mishmash fusion. And most of the dancing is Lindy Hop and tap dance based, right? Because it's a production that is like highlighting Bojangles with all of these showgirls. So, Hot Mikado, fascinating element of fusion. And then by the time we get to, so this is an excerpt from Chorus Line. By the time we get to like Fosse, the Fosse musical, we have the elements that you saw from Fred Astaire, but like less tap in this case. But what I want you to notice about this excerpt is the extreme athletic prowess. So this guy is so sharp, so big. Like, look at those ballet, like turning ballet leaps that he's doing there. But it's got this isolations of the body that come definitely from Africanist and like jazz social dancing. And also that like abstraction stiffness that came from the mid-century. Right? And I'm just trying to give you like a fast forward of the lineage of this kind of jazz dancing, right? So these are the Broadway shows that are the musicals that came from vaudeville. And by the time you get to the 1980s, corporations are funding these Broadway musicals, and that's how you get Cats. Cats is, costuming is so expensive for all of these costumes. And what they did was basically to make, Cats is famous really because this is the first musical that is showing that kind of extreme dance prowess as a musical, with that being the highlight. Like Cats barely even has a plot. It's based on poetry, so. It's got magic tricks.
This phenomenal cat produced 7 kittens right out of a hat.
It's got rock and roll. But previous to Fosse, and Fosse has a lot of dancing in it by the time we get to the 70s, but this is 80s. By the time you get to the 1980s, you have like whole musicals that are full of split leaps and quadruple pirouettes and huge dance numbers that are not just tapping, but that are like balletic level skill with this like rock and roll and Africanist motif. So that's sort of how the progression goes. It's a cat.
And we all said, oh, well, I never was there ever a cat so clever as magical Mr. Foley's.
It's like so lovable, but so weird. All right, so just for a recap of, right? Turn leap, turn leap, turn leap, turn leap, turn leap, turn leap, split leap. Shanae turns, drag, stag leap, and a somersault, right? Magical. Okay. So that kind of dancing is what gets us to competitive jazz dancing, competitive pom and cheer elements, right? Cheer, like straight cheerleading is gymnastics and arm balancing, and pom is like in between those two things. It's a mix of jazz dance and that. All right. So, bringing us up to sort of better attempts at hybridization is West Side Story. So West Side Story, the previous dancers that we had seen were focused more specifically on like jazz dance, so the evolution from swing dancing and tap on Broadway and mixing that with still jazz music and black dancing. But here we have the musical by Jerome Robbins is the choreographer, and Jerome Robbins was a ballet dancer first. So he was creating ballets, and then he moved, this is true of Balanchine also, moved into musical theater. And for Jerome Robinson, this is done in 1961, but it was on Broadway before that. He wanted to show the cultural dances of America, right? So it's set in New York City. He wants to show the actual communities of New York City. And Jerome Robbins had previously done work that included examples of like Russian folk dancing, and so this isn't off-brand for him. And he also did a musical that was all like tap and like about American soldiers. But this one is supposed to talk about Puerto Rican Americans, right? And it's a beloved, gorgeous, respectful plot line, right? West Side Story is Romeo and Juliet, but it's between the white gang and the Puerto Rican gang. The characters are treated with respect. They have complexity. And this song is actually about whether it's better to live in America versus Puerto Rico, largely because of institutional racism that keeps the characters from living in any neighborhood and like keeps them lower paid. And you can see that the dance elements of like those ballet jumps that they're doing are being mixed with sort of flamenco style arms and like Latin hip movements. But what you might not know unless someone told you is that these, okay, so we have Rita Moreno. Yay! One of our local treasures. But we also have a lot of actors in brownface. A lot. And that's because you have the Hollywood Corporation who wants to make sure they get a theme here, return on their investment. And so they're hiring people who are already Hollywood film stars to play parts in these roles. And we're going to get back to this idea next week when we talk about Hamilton. So what is changing nowadays is the idea of authentic casting when it comes to the races of the characters in mind, or blind casting. So blind casting we're going to talk in depth about next week, but for example, this is a 2021 version of America from West Side Story. The set looks a lot more realistic, right, than the mid-century set, which was more abstracted. And this is part of the theme of our aesthetic values right now, is that we have an increased valuation and appreciation for things being, although they're still romantic, more realistic. So I'm going to skip us forward a little bit, even though she's amazing.
Okay, by me in America, everything free in America.
For the small fee in America.
So the actors are appropriately cast, one assumes, for the most part.
One look at us and they charge twice.
I have my own washing machine.
What do you have though to keep clean?
Lyrics are the same.
Cadillacs zoom in America. Industry boom in America. Lots of new housing with more space.
So addressing the industrial, the redlining issues and segregation of housing.
If you can fight in America.
Life is alright in America.
If you're a white in America.
All right, let me go to the dance scene just because we're getting a little tight on time. So we still have skirt dancing going on, but we have giant jazz rondejambe kicks. Still have those arabesques that we saw in the last one, meaning that their leg is bent and out behind them. Their arm goes over it. Lots of turns. So this is, even though these legs, if you are not familiar with the difference between jazz and ballet, the leg kicks, the long leg kicks, are often very reminiscent of ballet for people. But you know that this is jazz versus ballet because there are isolations in the torso, right? Like they're rolling and snapping their shoulders, and the body really ripples in the middle as they're doing kicks and things. Whereas in ballet, the kicks and things happen, I just kicked my table, with a very straight body. Remember that more Eurocentric, icy cold stillness and control. Jazz dance throws that behind even when it has the kicks and leaves of ballet. Partner dancing. So I just want to also highlight the glory of musical theater. What we're watching here is a Disney production. So this is on a set. They could do retakes. They have a click track, but usually a recorded track of the music. So even though the actor or actress is probably at least lip syncing here, they're not actually performing the music while they're doing all this dancing. But when you go to see a Broadway musical live on stage, they're actually doing all of the singing perfectly as they're dancing. And that is not necessarily true when you go to see a live concert. When you go to see a pop star like Beyonce or, sorry, I'm trying to multitask and that never goes well. If you go to see a pop concert, Beyonce, SCA, any of those people who have dance numbers behind them, they're probably likely to have most of their singing recorded and playing a recording of their singing that they then talk, rap, or harmonize with over the top, so that if they are interrupted in their performance, the person who's running the sound for the concert just turns up the backing track so that they don't have to perform correctly with their vocals because they're doing the dancing. So Broadway musicals do both 100% live, and that is astonishing. All right, so leading us into next week. Yay, we covered all of our stuff. Leading us into next week, we're going to talk about we're still in the diversity theme. We're going to talk about authentic academics. So those performers who instead of coming from a platform and reaching down to create fusion so that the especially wealthy American audiences could open their minds to the different cultures in our country, there were also a group of people who are achieving the opening of American minds from the opposite direction. And so these are people like Catherine Dunham, who was an anthropologist first. She studied some ballet, but she mostly was focusing on studying the histories of the people in the Afro-Caribbean countries. And she took her interest of dance, studied in the Caribbean, learned the dances and about the rituals of that place. Same story is true of Pearl Primus, who was kind of a contemporary, who went to Africa to learn the rituals and dances in Africa. And they both brought back those elements of dance, but then they mixed them with the dances of the platform, right? So Jerome Robbins and Balanchine are already making money up here with the ballet audiences, and they're trying to like lift other dancers and choreographers and style into the American awareness. Catherine Dunham, Pearl Primus, Alvin Ailey, these are all people who are authentic to Africanist movement styles and who start hybridizing with the modern dance training that they get, and therefore bringing those styles into the mainstream public awareness. So that's the side of things we're going to talk about next week, and we'll move, as I said, into Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is doing a bit of both, and talk about what blind casting means, right? So that's the idea that you don't need to cast actors or dancers according to the character's race, ethnicity, background, but you could cast anybody, and that's how we got Hamilton. So coming up, more great dances next week. And is there anything else we want to close with? Boo, 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 boo. I think that will help us get into next week's assignments. Let me share screen just to drive you around where we go. Okay. All right, so this has been 90 Diversity. We are talking about fusion on Broadway, basically, musical theater, how its influences and primitivism, abstraction influenced the way that dances looked in the middle of the century. And then we started to look at things coming out of the mid-century on Broadway, such as the newer version of West Side Story and some Fosse dances. There are lots of extra links in here. So what we haven't talked a lot about, but I think you will really enjoy, are Hairspray, Elvis, and examples of Motown, which grew out, like rock and roll in general, grew out of Black R&B music. And when we get to Motown, right, 60s and 70s, the style of dancing and performance that trained Michael Jackson, you have these social dances from Black social dancing done in solo form, but then sort of smushed onto a production stage. Remember we talked about how the Wild West show also had that happen, where dances that were done in the round were then being performed in arenas or on stages, and so instead of performing them with the audience all the way around you, like flatten them out so that the audience in front of you sees them. The same thing really happens with Motown dances, and Motown dances turn into things like the Electric Boogaloo, which is where we get the start of hip hop as we know it. So I want to make sure that you get to see a lot of these amazing, influential videos here. Hairspray is a musical that is based on this story of how Black dance was being whitewashed by dance shows before we had Soul Train. It's enchanting and really fun to watch. So take a look at that. And then with MJ, he's sort of like the opposite situation, because MJ learned those dances from people like James Brown, but then when he became mega super popular, world famous, there were elements that in his training were making him more palatable to white audiences, which is definitely a step forward from situations like Elvis, where the music industry found a talented guy to basically steal the black culture and put their money behind the white guy, Elvis. With MJ, you have a young black talented man who comes from that Chitlin Circuit Motown background, who's been trained there, but who's also trained in things like elocution, self-presentation, and posture by people from the white community who want to make him more of a profit for the corporations. So that also relates us to Black Scent. This is a fabulous thing to check in on. We're going to talk about socioeconomic effects when we talk about our midterm. So don't skip this guy. And yeah, even more examples of Broadway getting it wrong in the early 50s, but they're fun to pick apart, to unpack, as it were. And then this is our discussion materials page, so you can see lots of the articles that I was referencing in our lecture here, and links to many of the videos that we saw today. All right, and we will continue on discussing blind casting and hybrid jazz next week in our example number 10. So I look forward to seeing you next week for 10, diversity and hybrid jazz and modern. Thanks so much for joining me. I will see you later.